doesn't love a rom-com? When they can be cute and clever with chemistry, that's a winning combination. Nobody Wants This is a rom-com series that's landed on Netflix, and it stars Kristen Bell and Adam Brody. So is this one going to earn a spot on your watch list? An agnostic podcast host and an unconventional rabbi on the rebound walk into a party. That just sounds like the start of a bad joke, right? Well, when they walk out together, the unlikely pair can tell there is something between them, but also potentially between them with their differing outlooks on life, all of the modern obstacles to love, and their sometimes well-meaning, sometimes sabotaging families. So in addition to Bell and Brody, this also stars Justine Lupe, Timothy Simons, Jackie Tohn, Cherry Cola, and Stephen Tobolowsky. Now, Bell and Lupe are sisters who have a sex and relationship-centered podcast. They're unreligious and snarky as they just transparently talk about their dating lives and their experiences. Now, Brody is a rabbi who is very devout, but he's also atypical when it comes to his faith. Now, one night, Brody and Bell meet at a party, and through some sarcastic banter, they hit it off, only to then proclaim that any sort of relationship between them is never going to work. Of course, though, we all know that they're certainly going to try to make it work. Now, this is way funnier than I imagined it would be. I mean, I know that both Bell and Brody can be really funny, but their dynamic works perfectly as they vacillate between the will they or won't they scenario that's also complicated by the should they or shouldn't they issues, which are raised from their differing systems of belief. Now, I love the chemistry that they share. While so much of their interactions are predictable, they also display a large sense of believability and realism. The banter is natural, and it doesn't come across as forced. And it's not always smiles and rainbows. There's quite a lot of conflict that comes into play, amping up the comedic moments even more as they provide solace from something tense or simply from some unexpected clever quip. Now, for as much as I did enjoy the back and forth of their kind of somewhat beginning sort of relationship, there's a lot of repetition to the interactions, which I think it's noticeable and then occasionally a bit mundane. There are 10, 25-ish minute episodes, and more than half of them feature wavering of some sort on one or both of the leads on whether or not the relationship should be pursued. Now, this wasn't a massive issue for the storytelling, but it would have been nice to have less repeated behaviors in favor of some novel ideas. While the romance portion definitely is felt between Bell and Brody, and they do have a lot of funny moments together, there's also a large amount of laughs that come about just thanks to all of the supporting cast and their incisive and real takes on the couple. Now, Brody and his family are devout Jews, while Bell and her family are anything but. This natural division lends itself to some wacky, even outlandish situations that mostly land with the humor. Now, the observational humor and situational comedy, they're both sharp and quick, and while some of it is a little bit unbelievable, it doesn't detract from the fun. Now, I love the insight and the background we get into the Jewish beliefs, along with presentations that I thought were a bit surprising. Now, don't think that this show is trying to proselytize or convert anybody. It's not. But the story does showcase some of the mindsets and traditions that they hold dear. I also appreciate that while Belle and her family aren't religious at all, the show isn't poking fun at those who don't have a faith or do have a faith. The large natural divide between a person of devout faith and an agnostic makes for intriguing complications as well as some excellent levity. Now, it might seem like this is also attempting to be sort of a fish out of water tale, taking one or both of the leads out of their comfort zones and then placing them into a scenario or lifestyle that's polar opposite of their own. While there is a small sense of that, it's not the focal point or even the angle of the narrative. These situations, they're used instead for plot progression and some laughs. And then for as much as religious beliefs do play a part in the story, this is way more about family and then the pressures and influence those have on individuals' lives, weighing in on romantic relationships, careers, expectations, even aspirations. The story isn't afraid to dive into these areas and examine them, looking at the same issues through several different lenses. And each perspective creates insightful observations as well as relatable humor. And then each side of the coin, it gets that examination. We get to experience how Belle and her family try to understand and then reconcile the Jewish faith with their own lack of religious beliefs. And then Brody and his family try to engage with, maybe even get along with Belle, who clearly has no clue about Judaism or its customs. And both lend themselves to some extremely funny and awkward exchanges that only help to endear us to the characters. Now, Justine Lupe is Belle's sister, and Timothy Simons is Brody's brother. As the respective sibling consciences and sounding boards, the familial bonds, they're relatable. I mean, not only with their support, but then also with just teasing. But when Simons and Lupe are together on screen, they also have amazing timing and awkward chemistry that makes them endearing to watch also. Now, I appreciate how similar they are, especially when living in their siblings' shadows, but neither can recognize the parallels between them. And their interactions, they're typically curt, but they're also hilarious, thanks to just deadpan deliveries. And without the family interactions, I don't think this show would land nearly as well as it does. Brody and Belle, they're great together, but when all of the various family members come into play, that's when so much of the hilarity cranks up, and it makes it a joy to watch. Now, going back to the repeated behaviors and interactions that Belle and Brody share for just a second, as the series approaches the finale, I was genuinely concerned that we'd be left with this massive cliffhanger. I mean, we just spent 10 episodes with characters, falling in love with them and their potential relationship. And with such short episode lengths, I wasn't sure how things are going to wrap up in the last chunk of minutes. Now, I think the ending to the season will both satisfy and frustrate to some extent. There is a sort of finality and conclusion to the story, but there's so much more that can happen. So, if Netflix decides to not renew this, which I do think would be dumb not to, we are presented with a resolution that we can infer what happens next. But if the streamer does renew, there's a plethora of story elements still left to explore. I think the reason this show works as well as it does, despite any shortcomings from repetition, is because of the chemistry between the entire cast. Almost every situation features some sort of strained interaction, creating opportunities for awkward deliveries, painful stumblings, wild misunderstandings, but also gleeful happiness and loving truths. The scripting is predictable and the trajectories are obvious, but thankfully the show heads exactly in the expected direction, leading to a touchingly sweet romance enhanced by laugh-out-loud comedy and then a relationship everybody can root for. There's sex, no nudity, a ton of profanity, and not really any violence. I give Nobody Wants This 4.5 out of 5 couches. Don't pay attention to the show's title. I think this is something most are going to want. So have there been any good rom-coms that you've seen lately? Let me know some recommendations in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.